The image that would haunt Colonel Jack Harrison for the rest of his life came not from the battlefield, not from the smoking wreckage of his shuttle, but from the bridge of a crippled warship drifting through the debris of a battle that had decided the fate of two civilizations. He stood there, blood streaming from a gash above his left eye, facing a being twice his size who had once sworn to protect the woman they both loved. High Commander Draven's plasma blade hummed with lethal intent, his obsidian eyes burning with hatred that transcended species. Somewhere across the void of space aboard the Imperial Dawn, Serafina was fighting to bring their daughter into a universe that might not survive to welcome her. Jack had spent 58 years learning that life rarely offered second chances. He had buried a wife. He had folded a flag over an empty casket when his son never came home from Afghanistan. He had watched his career dissolve into meaningless advisory positions and forgotten commendations, gathering dust in storage units across 3 states. Yet here he stood in the space between two civilizations, bleeding and broken and more alive than he had felt in decades. Fate had a particular talent for impossible situations, and Jack Harrison had apparently become its favorite subject. But to understand how a washed-up pilot from Texas ended up changing the fate of two species, you need to go back. 72 hours to be precise. Back to a ship called the USS Horizon, where the crew thought of him as furniture and the mission briefings never included his name. The observation deck of the Horizon offered a view that would have made poets weep and philosophers question everything they thought they knew about humanity's place in the cosmos. Jack sat alone in the corner booth that had become his unofficial territory over the past 3 months, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Through the reinforced glass, stars wheeled past in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures who dared to sail among them. He had stopped finding wonder in the view somewhere around month 2. Now it just reminded him of how far he was from anything that mattered. The tablet on the table displayed his daily schedule, a pathetic document that could be summarized in 3 words: nothing, nothing, and more nothing. Technical advisor, his official title read. What it actually meant was that the brass needed somewhere to put him where he could not cause any more trouble, and the Horizon's captain owed someone a favor. Jack had stopped asking questions about the political machinery that had deposited him here. He had stopped asking questions about most things. A burst of laughter from the main corridor pulled his attention toward the door. Through the glass panel, he could see a group of young officers heading toward the rec room, their movements carrying the easy confidence of people who still believed their futures held something other than decline. Lieutenant Tom Reeves broke away from the group, pushing through the observation deck door with a grin that had not yet learned how to become cynical. Tommy Reeves was 28 years old, fresh-faced, and possessed of the kind of optimism that Jack found simultaneously annoying and precious. He was also the only person on the ship who voluntarily sought out Jack's company, a fact that said something about either the young man's character or his lack of social awareness. The lieutenant dropped into the seat across from Jack without waiting for an invitation. His eyes carried questions that his mouth had not figured out how to ask yet. Jack watched him struggle with whatever was on his mind, finding a small measure of entertainment in the process. Finally, Tommy leaned forward, keeping his voice low, even though they were alone. He wanted to know about Baghdad. Everyone eventually wanted to know about Baghdad. The incident that had ended Jack's combat career had become something of a legend among the younger officers, though the details had been twisted through years of retelling until Jack barely recognized his own story. Jack set down his coffee cup and studied the young man across from him. There was genuine curiosity there, not the morbid fascination that usually accompanied such questions. Tommy actually wanted to understand, which was either admirable or foolish, depending on how you looked at it. The truth about Baghdad was simpler than the legend suggested. Jack had been flying air support during a ground operation when command ordered a strike on a building complex. Intelligence said insurgent leadership was meeting inside. What intelligence failed to mention was that the complex also housed a school and a medical clinic. Jack had seen the children in the courtyard through his targeting camera. He had heard the order crackling through his headset, and he had made a choice that would define every day that followed. 200 civilians lived because Jack Harrison refused to drop his payload. His career died the same day. The official record called it a navigational error, a face-saving compromise that pleased no one but allowed everyone to move forward without the messiness of courts-martial and public inquiries. Jack knew the truth, and apparently so did enough people to keep the whispers alive across decades. Tommy absorbed the story in silence, his expression shifting through several emotions before settling on something that looked like respect. He started to say something, probably something earnest and well-meaning, but the moment shattered when the ship's intercom crackled to life. Captain Martinez's voice filled the observation deck with news that would set everything in motion. Long-range sensors had detected an anomalous energy signature emanating from Krios 7, a frozen world deep within territory claimed by the Velthari Empire. Standard protocol called for logging the discovery and moving on. The Velthari were not openly hostile to humanity, but they were not friendly either. Their empire had existed for millennia before humans first looked up at the stars and wondered what lay beyond. They tolerated humanity's expansion into the galaxy, the way a lion might tolerate mice in distant corners of its territory. But the energy signature was unusual enough to warrant investigation, and the Horizon was the closest human vessel. Captain Martinez was requesting volunteers for a solo reconnaissance mission. The words hung in the recycled air of the observation deck, and Jack felt something stir in his chest that he had almost forgotten how to recognize. Purpose. The dangerous, addictive sensation of being needed for something more than filling space on a crew manifest. Tommy's eyes met Jack's across the table, and the young lieutenant started to speak, probably to argue against whatever he saw forming in the older man's expression. Jack was already on his feet, moving toward the door with determination that surprised them both. The bridge of the Horizon hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-trained crew doing routine work. Jack's entrance drew a few curious glances, but most of the officers returned to their stations after the briefest acknowledgement. He had become background noise to them, a relic from a war most of them knew only from history files. Captain Elena Martinez occupied the command chair with the natural authority of someone who had earned her position through competence rather than politics. She was 43, sharp-featured, and possessed of a reputation for fairness that made her crew genuinely loyal rather than merely obedient. When Jack approached, she raised an eyebrow that conveyed skepticism and mild interest in equal measure. He wanted the mission. The words came out more directly than he had intended, stripped of the diplomatic padding that usually accompanied requests through the chain of command. Martinez's expression flickered through surprise before settling into something more calculating. She reminded him of his status: technical advisor, non-combat role. The diplomatic complications if a human military officer, even a sideline one, was captured in Velthari space. Jack had heard every variation of these objections before. They had lost their power to sting years ago. What he said next changed everything, though he would not understand how much until much later. He told her that nobody else would volunteer. The mission parameters made that certain. Solo flight into potentially hostile territory, limited communication capability, zero backup if things went wrong. The young pilots on the Horizon had futures to protect, families waiting for them back on Earth, careers still climbing toward their peaks. Jack had none of those things. What he had was 58 years of experience, instincts honed by real combat, and absolutely nothing to lose. Martinez studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes weighing factors that Jack could only guess at. Then she nodded once, a gesture so small it might have been mistaken for a muscle twitch. She told him the shuttle would be ready in 2 hours. She also told him not to cause an interstellar incident. Jack allowed himself a small smile, the first genuine one in longer than he could remember. He told her he would do his best, and they both knew it was not really a promise. The shuttle bay smelled like machine oil and recycled air, familiar scents that carried Jack back through decades of similar moments. He had stood in bays like this one before every major operation of his life, checking equipment, running mental checklists, trying not to think too hard about what waited on the other side of the launch. The pre-mission ritual had become almost meditative over the years, a way of emptying his mind of everything except the immediate task. Tommy found him there, working through the shuttle's systems with methodical precision. The young lieutenant's face carried an expression that Jack recognized from his own youth, that particular mixture of concern and frustration that came from caring about someone who insisted on making dangerous choices. The conversation that followed was brief but important. Tommy asked why, not why the mission specifically, but why everything. Why volunteer for what might be a suicide run? Why seek out danger when safety was an option? Why choose this over the quiet fade that retirement offered? Jack's hands paused over the diagnostic panel as he considered the question. He could have given an easy answer, something about duty or boredom, or the simple need to feel useful. Instead, he found himself telling Tommy the truth. His son Michael had been a rescue pilot, search and recovery operations in Afghanistan, the kind of work that combined extreme danger with the possibility of saving lives. Michael had loved it, had thrived on the purpose it gave him, had written letters home that burned with the conviction that what he was doing mattered. When the helicopter went down in the Hindu Kush, when the recovery teams found nothing but wreckage and silence, Jack had lost more than a child. He had lost the person who made him believe that courage still meant something in a world that seemed determined to prove otherwise. The years since had been a long, slow erosion of everything Jack thought he knew about himself. The grief had hollowed him out. The forced retirement had taken away his structure. Margaret's cancer had stripped away his hope. By the time he found himself aboard the Horizon, he had become a ghost, wearing human skin, going through motions that no longer connected to anything real. But standing here now, preparing for a mission that might kill him, Jack felt something different. Not hope exactly, nothing so clean or simple. More like the faint stirring of a man who had been sleeping too long and was finally starting to wake up. He told Tommy that he was done waiting to die. If the universe wanted to end him, it would have to catch him moving. Tommy stood in silence for a moment after Jack finished speaking. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it into Jack's palm. It was a medallion tarnished with age bearing the image of a saint that Jack did not recognize. Tommy's grandmother had given it to him before his first deployment. Lucky, he said. Brought him home every time. Jack started to protest to say that he could not accept something so personal, but Tommy was already walking away. The young man paused at the bay door and looked back, his expression carrying weight beyond his years. He told Jack to bring it back himself. Jack owed him that much. Then he was gone, and Jack was alone with the shuttle and the medallion and the vast unknown waiting beyond the launch doors. The transition from the Horizon's artificial gravity to the shuttle's smaller field always produced a moment of disorientation, a brief instant where the body forgot which way was down. Jack settled into the pilot's seat and let muscle memory take over, running through launch procedures he had performed 1,000 times on 100 different vessels. The controls were newer than what he was used to, sleeker and more automated, but the fundamentals remained the same. Trust the machine until you could not then trust your instincts. Launch was smooth, the shuttle sliding out of the Horizon's bay and into the star-scattered darkness with barely a tremor. Jack watched the mothership recede in his rear display, shrinking from the only safety he had known for months into a distant speck, barely distinguishable from the background stars. Then he turned his attention forwarded toward Creos 7 and whatever waited there. The journey took 4 hours, long enough for doubt to creep in around the edges of his determination. Jack kept himself busy with system checks and sensor calibrations, tasks that occupied his hands without demanding much from his mind. The shuttle's autopilot handled navigation with mechanical precision, leaving Jack free to think. Sometimes that was the last thing he wanted. Creos 7 grew from a point of light to a visible disk to a world that filled his forward viewport with hostile beauty. The planet was a study in contrasts, brilliant white ice fields broken by dark mountain ranges, swirling storm systems that moved across the surface like living things, occasional glimpses of something that might have been frozen oceans beneath the eternal clouds. Nothing in the initial scans suggested habitability. Nothing suggested the presence of the vast Velthari military infrastructure that human intelligence believed existed somewhere in this system. The planet looked empty, abandoned, forgotten by whatever cosmic forces had shaped it billions of years ago. Jack was adjusting his approach vector when the interference hit. It started as a flutter in his navigation display, numbers jumping erratically before settling back to normal. Then the communications array went dark. Then the engines coughed again. Within seconds, the shuttle had transformed from a functioning spacecraft into an extremely expensive coffin, plummeting toward an alien world. Emergency training kicked in before conscious thought could catch up. Jack's hands flew across the manual controls, bypassing the electronic systems that had become useless. He had flown planes this way before in simulations, and once memorably over Iraqi airspace, when an electromagnetic pulse from an experimental weapon had turned his F-16 into a very fast glider. The principle was the same regardless of the vehicle use: what still worked, compensate for what did not, and hope that you found ground before you found death. The atmosphere hit the shuttle like a fist. Jack felt the G-forces pressing him into his seat, felt the hull groaning under stresses. It was never designed to handle, felt the temperature inside the cockpit climbing as friction converted velocity into heat. Through the shaking viewport, he caught glimpses of the approaching surface, white and gray and terrifyingly solid. What saved him was not skill alone. It was stubbornness, the same quality that had defined his entire life. Jack Harrison had been told he was finished more times than he could count, by superior officers who thought he was too reckless, by doctors who found shadows on Margaret's scans, by grief counselors who suggested he might not want to be alone so much. He had survived all of it through the simple refusal to accept that the story was over. The shuttle hit a snowfield at an angle that should have killed him instantly. Instead, the impact converted forward momentum into a long, violent slide that tore the craft apart piece by piece while somehow keeping the cockpit intact. Jack rode out the chaos strapped into his seat, teeth clenched against the battering, watching the universe become a blur of white and fire and screaming metal. When everything finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the noise had been. Jack hung upside down in his harness, blood dripping from a cut above his eye onto what used to be the ceiling. The cockpit window had cracked, but held, offering him an intimate view of alien snow mere inches from his face. Warning lights that still functioned painted the interior in alternating red and amber. The smell of burnt electronics and leaked coolant filled his nostrils. He was alive. For the moment, that would have to be enough. Extracting himself from the wreckage took longer than it should have. The harness release had jammed, requiring Jack to cut himself free with a knife from his survival kit. His powered armor had protected him from the worst of the impact, but he could feel bruises forming across his body like a map of every piece of debris that had struck him. The environmental seals had held, which meant he could breathe the filtered air inside his helmet. Small mercies in a situation that offered few. Outside the shuttle, Creo 7 revealed itself as a world designed to kill anyone foolish enough to visit. The temperature readout on Jack's helmet display showed negative 52 degrees Celsius and falling. Wind whipped ice particles across the landscape with enough force to sandblast exposed skin. The sky was a uniform gray, heavy with clouds that promised more of the same weather that had likely contributed to his crash. Jack's first priority was shelter. The shuttle's hull might have provided some protection, but the structural damage made it a poor long-term solution. His armor's power cells showed 43% charge, enough for perhaps 20 hours of full environmental support. After that, he would be depending on whatever warmth the planet offered, which appeared to be none at all. The scanner built into his helmet detected a geological formation approximately 2 kilometers to the north. Rock formations meant potential caves, and caves meant protection from the wind. It was not much of a plan, but it was better than standing in the open, waiting to freeze. The trek through the snow was brutal. Each step sank Jack knee-deep into powder that had the consistency of frozen sand. The wind fought him constantly, gusting hard enough to stagger him sideways and force him to plant his feet and wait for the worst to pass. Through it all, his helmet display tracked his position, his remaining power, and his estimated survival time with the clinical precision of a machine that did not understand the concept of hope. Halfway to his destination, Jack became aware that he was being watched. The feeling started as a prickle at the back of his neck, an instinct developed through decades of operating in environments where attention meant danger. He did not see anything when he scanned the surrounding landscape. The snow was an unbroken white, the sky an empty gray, the scattered rock formations too far away to hide anything larger than his imagination. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each passing minute. Jack reached the rock formation as his power reserves dropped below 30%. The scanner had been right about one thing: there were caves here, openings in the dark stone that promised shelter from the wind. What the scanner had not detected was the evidence of occupation. Scorch marks on the rock near one entrance. Footprints in the snow that were far too large to be human. A faint smell that cut through even his helmet's filters. Something organic and unfamiliar. He chose a smaller cave entrance, one that showed no signs of recent use, and spent the next hour making it habitable. The survival kit from the shuttle included thermal blankets, emergency rations, and a portable heater that would extend his survival time by perhaps another day. Jack arranged everything with military precision, creating a defensible position that would give him the best chance if whatever shared this rock formation decided to investigate. Then he set the traps. Old techniques learned from veterans of conflicts that predated his birth and refined through his own experience. Thin wires strung across the approach paths, empty ration containers filled with small stones balanced to fall and clatter if disturbed. Nothing that would stop a determined enemy, but enough to give him warning. Night fell fast on Creo 7. One moment the gray sky held a faint luminescence that passed for daylight. The next darkness swallowed everything beyond the small circle of Jack's emergency light. He sat with his back against the cave wall, pulse rifle across his lap, watching the entrance and listening to the wind howl outside. Sleep came in fragments, brief periods of unconsciousness interrupted by the constant vigilance that had become second nature over the years. Jack dreamed of Margaret, of Michael, of the life he had built and lost. He dreamed of falling through endless clouds toward a surface that kept receding. He dreamed of golden eyes watching him from the darkness, ancient and curious and utterly alien. The traps went off at approximately 3 hours before dawn. Jack was on his feet with his rifle raised before the echoes of the falling containers had faded. His helmet display showed nothing on infrared, which should have been impossible. Anything warm-blooded would have registered. Anything moving would have left a thermal signature. Yet the traps had triggered, which meant something was out there. He waited. The wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence that amplified every small sound. Jack could hear his own breathing, could hear the faint hum of his armor's systems, could hear the distant crack of ice shifting somewhere in the frozen landscape. Then he heard something else, footsteps approaching from the direction of the entrance, too heavy to be human, too deliberate to be any animal he could imagine. The figure that emerged from the darkness stopped Jack's breath in his chest. She was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet of lean muscle and alien grace. Her skin seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, the color of sunset, seen through autumn leaves, beautiful and strange and utterly inhuman. Hair the shade of polished copper fell past her shoulders, moving slightly in ways that suggested it might be something other than hair entirely. She wore armor that seemed grown rather than manufactured, overlapping scales and shades of orange and gold that left portions of her arms and torso exposed to the elements she apparently found no more threatening than a summer breeze. Most striking were her eyes. Gold as molten metal, slitted like a cat's, fixed on Jack, with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. There was intelligence there, vast and ancient, but also something else. Pain. The eyes of someone who had seen too much and found too little worth remembering. She was also bleeding. A dark stain spread across her left side, visible even against the warm tones of her skin. Her breathing was labored in a way that suggested broken ribs or worse. She leaned against the cave wall for support, her height making the gesture seem almost incongruous, like a tower trying to find balance against a fence. The weapon she carried looked like it might be the offspring of a spear and a plasma rifle, elegant and deadly, and pointed directly at Jack's chest. Her grip on it was firm, despite her obvious injuries, the stance of someone who had fought wounded before and expected to do so again. For a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Jack kept his rifle raised, knowing it was probably insufficient against whatever technology her people possessed, but unwilling to show weakness. She watched him with those golden eyes, evaluating, calculating, perhaps deciding whether killing him was worth the effort. When she finally spoke, her voice was deep and musical, carrying harmonics that human vocal cords could never produce. The translator built into Jack's helmet converted her words with only a fraction of delay. She wanted to know what he was. Jack kept his own weapon steady as he answered. Human, pilot, currently having a very bad day. He watched her process the information, saw something flicker across her alien features that might have been surprise. She knew of humans. Her voice carried contempt that needed no translation. Weak creatures, short-lived, fragile. Her people had studied human expansion through the galaxy the way one might study a particularly ambitious species of insect. Curious about their persistence, but never concerned about their threat. Jack felt a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth despite the situation. Weak maybe, fragile definitely, but still breathing, which was more than he could say for whoever put those holes in her. The words came out before he could consider the wisdom of antagonizing an injured alien who outmassed him by at least 100 pounds. Her eyes narrowed. The weapon in her hands did not waver, but something in her posture shifted. He had surprised her. Perhaps humans did not usually talk back to their betters. She informed him that her injuries were none of his concern. She also informed him that he was trespassing on sovereign Velthari territory, that his presence constituted an act of aggression under the Treaty of Distant Shores, and that she would be well within her rights to execute him where he stood. Jack lowered his rifle slightly, a calculated gesture that said he was not backing down, but was not looking for a fight either. He told her that executing him would require her to stop bleeding first, and from what he could see, she did not have that kind of time. He offered to help. Combat medic training decades old but still serviceable. He had patched up worse injuries than hers in worse conditions than this cave. The silence that followed stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Jack watched her weighing the offer, saw the war between pride and pragmatism playing out across her features. She was dying. They both knew it. The only question was whether she would allow a member of a species she considered beneath her to save her life. In the end, survival won. It usually did. She sank to the cave floor with a grace that seemed impossible, given her injuries, arranging herself against the wall in a position that kept him in view while minimizing her vulnerability. Then she gestured with her free hand, a sharp motion that clearly meant, get on with it. Jack approached slowly, keeping his movements visible and non-threatening. Up close, her injuries were worse than he had initially assessed. Something had torn through her side with tremendous force, leaving a wound that would have killed a human outright. The dark blood that seeped from it had an iridescent quality, reflecting his helmet light in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. He talked as he worked, a habit developed over years of treating wounded soldiers who needed distraction more than silence. He told her about the crash, about the interference that had killed his systems, about his suspicion that this planet's electromagnetic properties had something to do with both their situations. She listened without responding, at first her golden eyes tracking his every movement as he cleaned and sealed the wound with supplies from his kit. Gradually, the tension in her shoulders began to ease. Not trust exactly, more like the acknowledgement that he had not tried to kill her yet, which apparently counted for something. When he finished, she examined his work with the critical eye of someone who had seen plenty of battlefield medicine. Adequate, she pronounced, for a primitive. Jack sat back on his heels and studied her properly for the first time without the immediate pressure of bleeding to distract him. She was striking, he realized, in the way that a storm or a wildfire might be striking, terrible and magnificent and utterly beyond human scale. He asked her what had done this to her. The question seemed to catch her off guard, or perhaps she was simply not used to being questioned by creatures she considered inferior. Either way, she took her time responding. When she finally spoke, her words carried a weariness that transcended the physical. Betrayal, the oldest story in any civilization, alien or otherwise. Someone she had trusted had decided she was no longer useful. Jack knew that story too well. He told her so, and something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, nothing so soft, more like the recognition of a fellow traveler on a road nobody chose willingly. She told him her name, though the sounds required his translator to work overtime. Seraphina, the closest human approximation, came out. Queen of the Velthari Empire, ruler of 1,000 star systems, and currently hiding in a cave on a frozen world while her most trusted commander consolidated power over everything she had spent 2 centuries building. The revelation should have shocked him. It did a little, but Jack had stopped being surprised by the universe's particular brand of dark comedy long ago. Of course he would crash land on the same planet as a dethroned alien queen. Of course his day would go from bad to catastrophically complicated. It was almost fitting in a way that made him want to laugh and curse in equal measure. Instead, he introduced himself properly. Colonel Jack Harrison, United States Air Force, retired and reactivated technical advisor to the USS Horizon, and apparently the worst rescue pilot in human history, given his current circumstances. Something that might have been amusement flickered across her features. She informed him that his titles were meaningless. She also informed him that he was still technically her prisoner, regardless of any assistance he might have rendered. And she told him that if either of them wanted to survive the next 48 hours, they would need to find a way to work together. She explained the political realities with the weary expertise of someone who had navigated such treacherous waters for centuries. High Commander Draven had been her husband's closest friend, a warrior who had sworn to protect her when King Theron fell in battle 50 years ago. For decades, she had trusted him, implicitly relied on his counsel, believed in his loyalty. She had not seen the obsession growing beneath his service, the love that had curdled into something possessive and dark. The assassination attempt had been elegant in its simplicity. An ambush during her private visit to this world made possible only by someone who knew her movements intimately. Draven soldiers wearing the uniforms of her own guard. The wound in her side delivered by a blade meant to make it look like a random attack by the planet's wildlife. If she did not return to the capital within 48 hours, Draven would legally assume the role of regent. His first act would be to declare her dead. His second would be to consolidate power over the military. His third, she suspected, would be to launch a war against humanity that would devastate both species. Jack considered his options. They numbered exactly one. Outside the cave, the storm had returned with renewed fury. Inside, an alien queen and a human pilot began an unlikely alliance that neither of them could have predicted. Jack had been called many things in his 58 years, but never before had anyone called him a queen's last hope. He supposed there was a first time for everything, even at the end of a life that had seemed determined to offer nothing but endings. The first hours of their forced alliance established a rhythm that surprised them both. Serafina required rest to heal her Velthari physiology, working to repair damage that would have killed any human 3 times over. Jack kept watch at the cave entrance, his rifle across his knees, listening to the storm rage outside while his mind worked through scenarios that all ended badly. The Queen slept in short bursts, never fully unconscious, always aware of his position in the small space they shared. Trust remained a foreign concept between them, but necessity had forged something that served the same purpose. Dawn arrived as a gradual lightening of the gray sky, the storm finally exhausting itself into sporadic gusts that no longer threatened to tear the flesh from bone. Jack's power reserves had dropped to 18% during the night, a number that gave him approximately 6 hours before his armor became useless. He was considering his limited options when Serafina stirred behind him, her movement fluid despite the wound that should have kept her immobile for weeks. She crossed to the cave entrance and stood beside him, her towering form blocking what little light filtered through the clouds. Her eyes scanned the horizon with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to reading landscapes for threats. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the weakness he might have expected from someone who had lost so much blood mere hours ago. The path to her emergency shelter was clear, but they would need to move quickly. The frost serpent, a massive predator native to these mountains, had moved through the area during the night. She could sense its absence now, but the creature's hunting patterns were unpredictable. They might have hours of safety or merely minutes. Jack rose to his feet, joints protesting the cold that had seeped through even his armor's insulation. He asked about the shelter, its distance, its defenses, information that would determine whether this journey ended in salvation or a frozen grave. Serafina explained as they gathered what few supplies remained. The shelter was her private refuge, unknown to anyone in the Empire except herself. She had built it decades ago during a period when the pressures of the crown had threatened to crush her entirely. A place to escape, to remember who she had been before duty consumed everything else. The irony of hiding there, now hunted by her own people, was not lost on her. The trek began in silence, each of them conserving energy for the challenges ahead. The snow had developed a crust during the night thick enough to support Seraphine's weight, but treacherous for Jack's smaller frame. He broke through, constantly fighting for every step, while she moved across the surface with effortless grace. After the 4th time he sank waist-deep into a hidden drift, she stopped and turned to face him. Her expression carried something that might have been exasperation or perhaps a distant cousin of concern. She observed that humans were poorly designed for survival, too small, too weak, too dependent on technology that failed at critical moments. How his species had managed to spread across the stars remained one of the galaxy's more puzzling mysteries. Jack hauled himself out of the drift and wiped snow from his visor. He told her that stubbornness counted for more than design. Humans had crawled out of caves and crossed oceans in wooden ships and walked on their moon using computers less powerful than a child's toy. They survived not because they were built for it, but because they refused to accept the alternative. Something shifted in her golden eyes as she processed his words. Not agreement exactly, more like the reluctant acknowledgement of a point she could not easily dismiss. She turned and continued walking, but her pace slowed almost imperceptibly, accommodating his limitations without drawing attention to the adjustment. They traveled for 3 hours before reaching the entrance to the Frost Serpent's territory. The landscape changed abruptly at an invisible boundary, flat snow fields giving way to a maze of ice formations that rose from the ground like frozen monuments to some forgotten god. The structures caught what little light penetrated the clouds, refracting it into rainbows that danced across the blue-white surfaces. Beautiful and deadly, Jack thought. The galaxy seemed to specialize in that combination. Serafina stopped at the edge of the formation, her body tensing in ways that spoke of predator recognition at a primal level. The serpent made its home somewhere within this labyrinth, she explained. The creature was ancient, older than her empire, a survivor from an era when Creo 7 had been something other than a frozen wasteland. It hunted through vibration and heat, detecting prey from incredible distances and striking with speed that defied its massive size. Jack studied the ice maze, his tactical mind automatically mapping potential routes and choke points. He asked if there was another way around, already knowing the answer from the resignation in her posture. No. The maze stretched for kilometers in either direction, and the terrain beyond its borders was impassable. They had to go through. The shelter lay on the other side, perhaps 2 hours of careful travel if they were lucky. Less if they were fast, never if they were careless. They entered the maze together, moving in a formation that balanced her superior senses against his combat experience. Serafina led her ability to detect the serpent's presence, their best early warning system. Jack followed close behind, rifle ready, watching for threats from angles she might miss. The ice walls rose around them, cutting off the sky, and creating corridors that twisted in ways that confused his sense of direction within minutes. The first sign of danger came not as sound, but as sensation, a vibration through the ice beneath their feet, rhythmic and growing stronger. Serafina froze, one hand raised in warning. Jack dropped into a combat crouch, scanning the crystalline walls for any sign of movement. The serpent emerged from a wall to their left, its massive body crashing through ice that should have been solid enough to stop a tank. Jack's first impression was of scales and teeth, an impossible length of muscle and hunger that seemed to have no end. The creature's head alone was larger than his entire body, equipped with jaws that could swallow him whole without the inconvenience of chewing. Training took over before fear could paralyze him. Jack threw himself to the side as those jaws snapped shut where he had been standing, rolled, came up firing. His pulse rifle shot struck the serpent's scales and scattered like rain off stone. The creature barely seemed to notice, its attention fixed on the warm bodies that had invaded its domain. Serafina moved with speed that blurred the boundaries of what Jack had thought possible. Her weapon came up, firing bolts of plasma that actually seemed to hurt the beast, scoring black marks across its pale scales. The serpent screamed, a sound that resonated through the ice and threatened to shake loose avalanches from the formations above. They ran. There was no other option. The serpent pursued its massive body, somehow navigating the tight corridors with horrifying grace. Jack's lungs burned as he pushed his armor to its limits, the power reserves dropping with every desperate burst of speed. Beside him, Serafina moved with fluid efficiency, but even she was breathing hard, her wound reopening to leave dark drops on the pristine ice. The corridor ahead split into 3 branches. Serafina grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the leftmost passage, her grip strong enough to leave bruises even through his armor. Behind them, the serpent's bulk wedged momentarily in the narrow opening, buying them precious seconds. They emerged into a wider chamber, and Jack saw their chance. The ceiling above was unstable, massive icicles hanging like nature's own guillotines. His rifle might be useless against the serpent's hide, but the ice was another matter. He shouted a warning to Serafina and opened fire on the ceiling. The icicles fell like spears, crashing down behind them and creating a barrier of broken ice that the serpent would have to circle around. It was not a permanent solution, but it would slow the creature down. Serafina stared at him as they caught their breath, her golden eyes reflecting something that might have been reassessment. She observed that his solution was not entirely incompetent for a member of a primitive species. Jack managed a grim smile despite the adrenaline still flooding his system. He told her that coming from her, he would take that as high praise. Then he noticed the blood seeping through her fingers where she pressed them against her side, and the brief moment of levity evaporated. She was in worse shape than she was admitting. The wound had reopened badly, and her face had taken on a grayish undertone that could not be healthy for any species. When she took a step forward, her leg buckled, and Jack caught her before she could fall. The weight of her was staggering, but he braced himself and held firm. She tried to push away pride, warring against physical reality. He told her to stop being stubborn and accept help. They could argue about species superiority after they were both safe. Something in his tone broke through her resistance. She leaned against him just slightly and allowed him to guide her forward. They moved through the ice maze together, her arm across his shoulders, his arm around her waist, an awkward partnership born of desperate necessity. The shelter appeared as if conjured by their need, a doorway hidden in what had seemed to be solid rock. Serafina pressed her palm against a panel invisible to Jack's eyes, and the stone slid aside to reveal a corridor leading into the mountain's heart. They stumbled inside together, and the door sealed behind them, cutting off the frozen world and whatever might be hunting them within it. Jack lowered Serafina to the floor, as gently as he could manage, then turned to examine their sanctuary. The shelter was larger than he had expected, multiple chambers carved from the living rock and equipped with technology that hummed with quiet efficiency. Lights activated as they moved deeper inside, responding to their presence with an intelligence that suggested advanced automation. The medical bay occupied a chamber near the center of the complex. Jack helped Serafina onto a bed designed for her larger frame, then began searching for supplies that might help with her wound. The equipment was alien labels in a script he could not read, but medicine had certain universals that transcended species. She guided him through the process with words that grew increasingly slurred. The blood loss was catching up with her, the adrenaline of their escape fading to reveal the true extent of the damage. Jack worked quickly, cleaning and sealing the wound with tools that responded to his touch in ways he did not fully understand. When he finished, her eyes had closed, her breathing shallow but steady. He sat beside the bed and watched her sleep, this impossible queen from the stars who had somehow become his responsibility. The cosmos seemed to specialize in irony that would make dramatists weep with envy, and Jack Harrison had apparently become its favorite subject. Hours passed. Jack explored the shelter while Serafina recovered, discovering supplies that would keep them alive for weeks and communication equipment that remained stubbornly dead. Whatever interference had brought down his shuttle was blocking her technology as well. They were truly cut off, isolated on a frozen world, while events they could not see or influence shaped the future of both their peoples. When Serafina finally woke, the quality of her attention had changed. She watched him with eyes that held questions instead of contempt, curiosity instead of dismissal. He had saved her life twice now, first in the cave and again during their flight through the ice maze. Such debts carried weight in her culture, obligations that could not be easily ignored. She asked him about his life, not the facts that military records contained, but the substance beneath them. What drove a human male to throw himself into danger for a stranger? What made him offer help to a creature who had declared him a prisoner? What he hoped to gain from actions that seemed to offer nothing but risk? Jack considered his answer carefully. He told her about Margaret, about watching cancer consume the woman he loved over months that felt like years. He told her about Michael, about the pride of watching his son become a man, and the devastation of bearing an empty casket. He told her about the slow erosion of everything that had given his life meaning, the jobs that did not matter, the days that blurred together, the growing certainty that he was simply waiting to die. She listened without interruption, her golden eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, the silence between them had changed character. It was no longer the wary quiet of enemies forced into proximity. It was something else, something that neither of them had words for. She began to speak of her own losses. Her husband Theron, dead these 50 years, killed in a war against an enemy that no longer existed. The children, they had never had, a grief that grew sharper with each passing decade. The isolation of the crown, surrounded always by people who wanted something from her, never simply wanting her. Draven had been Theron's closest friend, she continued. When the king died, the High Commander had sworn to protect her, to serve the Empire, in memory of the man they had both loved. For decades, she had believed in that oath. She had trusted Draven, as she trusted few others, relied on his counsel, valued his loyalty. She had not seen the love that festered beneath his service, had not recognized the resentment that grew when she failed to transfer her affections to him, had not understood that protection could become possession in a heart twisted by unrequited desire. Jack absorbed the story in silence, recognizing patterns that transcended species and civilization. Power corrupted. Love curdled into obsession. Trust became the weapon that cut deepest. Human or Velthari, some truths remained constant across the stars. He asked about the timeline, the practical details that would determine their next moves. How long before Draven's position became unassailable? How they might reach allies who could challenge his claim? What resources the shelter contained that might help them fight back? Serafina explained that the Empire's succession laws required 48 hours between a monarch's death and the confirmation of a new ruler. This grace period allowed for challenges for evidence to be presented for the truth to emerge before irreversible decisions were made. If she could reach loyal forces before that window closed, she might reclaim her throne. If not, Draven would have the legal authority to declare her a pretender, an impostor, an enemy of the state she had ruled for 200 years. They had entered the shelter with perhaps 30 hours remaining. Travel time to the nearest communication array that might penetrate the interference would consume most of that. The mathematics were brutal, leaving no margin for error. Jack stood and began preparing for departure. He told her that they had better get moving then. Long odds were better than no odds, and he had made a career of proving statistics wrong. She watched him gather supplies, her expression unreadable. When she spoke, her words carried a weight that stopped him in his tracks. She asked why he cared. What stake did a human have in Velthari politics? Why risk his life for a throne that meant nothing to his people? Jack turned to face her, considering the question seriously. He could have given noble answers about justice and righteous causes. He could have spoken of duty and honor and the principles that had guided his military career. Instead, he told her the truth. He was tired of watching things fall apart, tired of losing, tired of standing on the sidelines while the universe decided who lived and who died without his input. She was fighting to save something she believed in, and that was more than he had done in years. Maybe helping her would not change anything about his own situation. Maybe they would both die in the attempt. But at least he would die, moving forward instead of standing still. Serafina rose from the medical bed, her movements steadier than they had been. She crossed to where he stood and looked down at him from her considerable height. For a long moment, she simply studied his face, reading something in his features that he could not identify. Then she told him that he was a strange creature, this human who spoke of death so casually while fighting so hard to live. She told him that she had spent 2 centuries believing her people superior to all others in the galaxy. She told him that he was making that belief increasingly difficult to maintain. Jack smiled despite the gravity of their situation. He told her that humans specialized in difficult. It was practically a species trait. They left the shelter as the planet's short day began to fade. The path Serafina chose wound through mountain passes that offered protection from surveillance, while demanding everything their bodies could give. Jack's armor power had recovered somewhat from the shelter's charging systems, but he knew better than to trust the readings completely. Technology had failed him before and would likely fail him again. The hours blurred together into an endless march through ice and stone. They spoke little, conserving breath for the climb, but the silence between them had lost its hostile edge. Something had shifted in the shelter, some wall had crumbled that neither of them had consciously built. Jack found himself noticing things about her that went beyond tactical assessment. The way she moved fluid and powerful even when exhausted. The set of her jaw when determination overrode discomfort. The occasional glances she cast his way, evaluating him with criteria he could only guess at. The attack came without warning as they navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. Plasma fire erupted from the rocks above, bolts of superheated energy that turned snow to steam and stone to slag. Jack threw himself behind cover, his rifle coming up instinctively, scanning for targets he could not see. Beside him, Serafina had drawn her own weapon, her eyes blazing with fury that transcended the merely physical. Draven's soldiers. A kill squad sent to finish what the initial ambush had started. 6 of them, Jack counted, positioned to catch them in a crossfire that should have been lethal, would have been lethal against anyone else. Jack had survived ambushes before, in Iraq and Afghanistan, in classified locations that officially did not exist. The principles remained the same regardless of the weapons involved. Identify cover, locate enemies, suppress and maneuver. Simple concepts that became infinitely complex when plasma was melting the rock inches from your head. He shouted coordinates to Serafina, translating battlefield geometry into terms her tactical mind could use. She responded with covering fire that forced 2 of the ambushers to duck, buying him time to relocate to a better position. They worked together without discussion, instincts aligned by the simple need to survive. The first soldier fell to Serafina's plasma bolt, his body crumpling from a ledge to crash on the rocks below. Jack accounted for the second, a lucky shot that found a gap in the Velthari armor and dropped its wearer mid-stride. The remaining four pulled back, regrouping for another assault. But the damage was done. During the firefight, one of the plasma bolts had struck the ice above them. Jack heard the crack before he saw the avalanche beginning, a wall of white death descending toward their position with unstoppable momentum. He grabbed Serafina and pulled her toward the only shelter available, a narrow crevice in the rock face that might protect them from the worst of the impact. They wedged themselves inside as the avalanche roared past snow and ice, hammering against the stone with force enough to rattle bones. When the silence returned, they were trapped. The crevice had become a tomb sealed by debris that would take hours to clear. Jack's helmet display showed dropping oxygen levels and falling temperature. The armor would keep him alive for a while, but not forever. Serafina's breathing was labored in the tight space, her wound seeping again despite his earlier treatment. The cold was affecting her more than she admitted, her species clearly not designed for prolonged exposure to temperatures this extreme. Without shelter, without warmth, she would die before he did. Jack made a decision that surprised them both. He deactivated his armor's heating system and configured it to project warmth outward instead of conserving it internally. The cold hit him immediately, a knife of ice that cut through his undersuit and into his bones. But the temperature around Serafina stabilized, then began to rise. She realized what he was doing and tried to protest. He cut her off with words that came out through chattering teeth. He told her that one of them needed to survive to stop Draven. He told her that her people needed their queen more than the universe needed another broken old soldier. He told her to stop arguing and let him do something that mattered for once in his life. The cold deepened. Jack felt his consciousness beginning to fragment, thoughts scattering like leaves in a winter wind. He thought about Margaret, about the warmth of her hand in his during those final days. He thought about Michael, about the pride in his son's eyes the day he received his wings. He thought about all the things he had meant to do and never done, all the words he had meant to say and never said. He was dying. He knew it with a certainty that transcended fear, and somehow, improbably, he was at peace with it. Then warmth flooded through him, and he opened eyes he did not remember closing. Serafina crouched over him in the cramped space, her hands pressed against his chest, light emanating from her palms in patterns that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. Her face was a mask of concentration, sweat beading on her sunset-colored skin despite the cold that still gripped the crevice. She was doing something impossible. He could feel it, energy flowing from her into him, pushing back the cold, forcing life into limbs that had begun to surrender. The sensation was intimate beyond anything he had experienced, a connection that went deeper than flesh, touching something at the core of his being. When she finally pulled back, they were both changed. Jack could feel her presence in his mind, a warm glow at the edge of his consciousness that pulsed with emotions not his own. Surprise, concern, and something else, something that felt like the first tentative stirrings of wonder. Serafina stared at him with eyes gone wide, her breathing rapid, her composure shattered. She whispered words that his translator, rendered as impossible, repeated them, as if trying to convince herself of their truth. Soul bond, the most sacred connection in Velthari culture. A joining of essences that transcended physical form, that linked two beings at the deepest level of existence. It was supposed to happen only between Velthari, only between those who had spent years building the foundation of trust and love that such a bond required. It was never supposed to happen accidentally. It was never supposed to happen with an alien. Yet here they were, human and Velthari, bound together in ways that neither of them fully understood. Jack could sense her emotions as clearly as his own. Her shock, her fear, her desperate attempt to process what this meant for her throne, her people, her entire conception of how the universe worked. He reached out and took her hand, a gesture that felt simultaneously intimate and natural. He told her that they could figure out what this meant later. Right now, they needed to survive. The words seemed to anchor her. She nodded once, then turned her attention to the debris blocking their escape. The energy flowing through her system had accelerated her healing, and she attacked the ice with renewed strength. Jack joined her, and together they carved a path back to the surface. The remaining soldiers were gone, fled, or buried in the avalanche. The path ahead was clear, and the sky had begun to lighten with approaching dawn. They had hours remaining before Draven's position became unassailable, hours to cross impossible distances and challenge an enemy who commanded armies while they had only each other. Jack looked at Seraphina, at this impossible queen, who had somehow become the most important person in his existence. She looked back at him, and through their new bond, he felt her determination mixing with his own. They ran. The communication array rose from the ice like a monument to fading hope, its towers dark and silent against the gray sky. Seraphina had known it would be damaged. Draven was thorough and controlling. Communications was fundamental to any coup. But the extent of the destruction still struck her like a physical blow. Jack examined the wreckage with eyes that saw possibilities where others might see only failure. Years of keeping ancient aircraft flying with nothing but ingenuity and determination had taught him that destroyed did not always mean non-functional. He asked her to describe what the array needed to do, the basic principles of its operation. She explained, and he listened, translating alien concepts into frameworks he could understand. The technology was advanced beyond anything humanity had achieved, but technology still followed rules. Physics did not change just because the engineers were 8 feet tall and had golden eyes. 2 hours of frantic work followed. Jack stripped components from sections that were beyond saving and repurposed them for sections that might still function. Seraphina provided power from the reserves she had somehow retained, despite everything, her hands glowing, as she channeled energy into circuits that sparked and smoked and gradually came back to life. The array activated with a sound like thunder, its towers humming with power that split the clouds above. Seraphina seized the communication controls and began broadcasting, her voice carrying across frequencies that spanned the Empire. She announced her survival. She denounced Draven's treachery. She called upon all loyal Velthari to resist the usurper who had murdered their king's memory by betraying his queen. The response came faster than either of them had dared hope. Ships began appearing in orbit, their identification signals declaring loyalty to the crown. Admiral Kale, her oldest advisor, had refused to accept the news of her death. He had held the loyal fleet together through sheer force of will, waiting for proof that his queen still lived. But Draven had supporters too. The sky above Krios 7 filled with vessels representing both sides of a civil war that had erupted with Seraphina's broadcast. The Empire was tearing itself apart, and she was at the center of the destruction. Through their bond, Jack felt her anguish. She had never wanted this, had never imagined that her reign would end in her people killing each other over the question of her survival. The weight of responsibility threatened to crush her, and for a moment he felt her consider surrender, ending the conflict by ending herself. He rejected that impulse with every fiber of his being, and she felt his rejection as clearly as if he had shouted it. He told her that giving up was not an option. He told her that Draven would be worse for her people than any war. He told her that she was not allowed to die until she had taught the universe that humans and Velthari could build something together instead of just destroying each other. His words, backed by emotions she could no longer doubt, steadied her. She straightened her spine and returned to the communications array, coordinating the loyal forces with the strategic brilliance that had made her empire great. Draven's voice crackled across the channels, cold and confident. He dismissed her claims as the ravings of an impostor, a creature wearing the queen's face while the real Seraphina lay dead on the frozen plains. He called upon true Velthari to reject this abomination and the human contamination she represented. Jack felt the shift in Seraphina's emotions through their bond. Fury, yes, but also something else. A strange sense of validation, as if Draven's words had confirmed something she had only suspected. She asked Jack to stand beside her in front of the communication array's visual pickup. When he did, she placed her hand over his heart, and the bond between them flared visible, a web of golden light connecting them in ways that no technology could fake. She addressed her people with words that would reshape the destiny of 2 civilizations. She told them that, yes, she had bonded with a human. She told them that, yes, their union had produced something unprecedented. She told them that she carried within her the first child of both their species, a being who would bridge the gap between Velthari and humanity in ways that politics and treaties never could. Through their bond, Jack felt her revelation strike him with the force of a physical blow. Pregnant. The soul bond had done more than connect their minds. It had created something impossible, something that defied every biological barrier between their species. He sensed the new presence, now faint, but growing a third consciousness developing within the connection they shared. Serafina felt his shock and sent back reassurance tinged with her own wonder. She had known since the shelter had felt the change beginning in her body even as she healed him. She had not told him because she had not known how, had not understood what it meant, had barely believed it herself. The response to her announcement split the fleet even further. Some ships that had been neutral declared for her, moved by the magnitude of what she represented. Others that had been uncertain threw in their lot with Draven, horrified by the prospect of a hybrid heir. The battle lines hardened and the shooting began in earnest. Kael's ship took a direct hit as it maneuvered to protect Serafina's position on the surface. The old advisor's vessel shuddered and listed badly secondary explosions rippling through its hull. Through the communication channel, Jack heard Kael's voice, weak but determined. The admiral reported that his ship was crippled, but that he would hold the line. He told his queen to focus on the larger battle. He was not done fighting yet. The next 3 weeks blurred together in a chaos of political maneuvering, military positioning, and medical monitoring. Jack watched Serafina's pregnancy progress at a rate that defied all biological understanding, her body changing daily as their impossible child grew stronger. The loyal fleet had established a defensive perimeter around Kraos 7, buying them time to plan their next move while Draven consolidated his forces in the outer systems. Admiral Diana Chen's arrival changed everything. Jack's old friend from their academy days had worked miracles across diplomatic channels, convincing Earth Command that the alliance Serafina represented was humanity's best chance for peaceful coexistence with the Velthari Empire. The new Houston fleet emerged from hyperspace with weapons hot and shields raised, a gesture of support that shocked the conservative factions and heartened Serafina's loyalists. Diana's face appeared on the communication display, her expression carrying the weight of decisions that would determine the fate of millions. She observed dryly that Jack had always had a talent for finding trouble, but this exceeded even his usual standards. Jack grinned despite the gravity of their situation. He told her that when he committed to something, he did not do it halfway. The combined fleet now matched Draven's forces in numbers, though the outcome remained far from certain. The High Commander had spent decades building the Imperial military, and many of his captains owed their careers to his patronage. Loyalty bought through years of service would not dissolve overnight simply because their queen had returned from the dead. Serafina stood on the bridge of the Imperial Dawn, visibly pregnant now, despite only weeks having passed her condition, a testament to the unprecedented nature of their child's development. Through their bond, Jack felt Nova's presence growing stronger each day, a consciousness developing within their connection that was already beginning to exhibit traits of both species. The final battle began at dawn by shipboard time. Draven's fleet advanced in the traditional wedge formation, confident in their numerical parity and superior experience. They expected Serafina to meet them head-on to engage in the kind of straightforward fight that Velthari had waged for thousands of years. Jack had other ideas. He had spent weeks studying Velthari tactics, learning their patterns, understanding their assumptions. Human combat doctrine differed fundamentally from the Empire's approaches. Where Velthari favored set-piece battles formations and counter-formations, honor and tradition, governing engagement rules, humans had learned to fight dirty. Guerrilla tactics, asymmetric warfare, the willingness to appear weak in order to strike from unexpected angles. He outlined a plan that made several of the Velthari officers visibly uncomfortable. Feigned retreats, decoy formations, attacks that violated every principle of honorable combat. The strategy was crude by Imperial standards, undignified, the sort of approach that lesser species might employ when facing superior foes. It was also exactly what Draven would never expect. Serafina overruled her officers' objections with words that would echo through Imperial history. She declared that honor meant nothing if they lost. She declared that tradition was worthless if it led to extinction. She declared that the future required new approaches, and she was prepared to embrace them, regardless of how they made her ancestors spin in their crypts. The fleet scattered at the first sign of Draven's advance. Ships broke formation in what appeared to be panic, fleeing in multiple directions, as if discipline had collapsed entirely. Draven's commanders saw what they expected to see, a queen weakened by her condition, her forces demoralized by the impossibility of her situation. They pursued aggressively, individual squadrons chasing what looked like easy prey. The trap closed with precision that would be studied in military academies for generations. The fleeing ships had led their pursuers into carefully prepared kill zones positions where hidden forces waited in the shadow of asteroids and debris fields. What had appeared to be a rout became an ambush, then a massacre, as Draven's scattered squadrons found themselves surrounded and outgunned. Diana Chen's ships emerged from behind a moon, where they had been hiding, cutting off the escape route and forcing Draven's fleet to fight on two fronts. Human and Velthari vessels worked together with a coordination that should have been impossible, their tactics complementing each other in ways that neither species could have achieved alone. Through it all, Jack coordinated the chaos with a calm that surprised even himself. His voice carried across communication channels, directing squadrons, adjusting tactics, exploiting weaknesses as they appeared. The Velthari officers who had questioned his approach fell silent as they watched his strategy unfold, their skepticism dissolving in the face of results they could not deny. Admiral Kale's ship, patched together and barely functional after the damage it had sustained weeks before, held a critical position in the formation. The old advisor had refused evacuation, insisting that his experience was needed in the battle to come. Through the communication channel, Jack could hear Kale's voice directing his crew with the authority of 4 centuries of service. Then Draven's flagship launched a targeted strike at the Imperial Dawn. Kale saw it coming before anyone else. His damaged ship moved to intercept, placing itself between the incoming fire and the vessel carrying his queen. The impact tore through what remained of his shields, detonating the power core in a flash of light that was visible across the battlefield. Through their bond, Jack felt Seraphina's grief like a knife through his own heart. Kael had served her family for 400 years. He had been the last link to her father's reign, the mentor who had helped her become the queen she was. His final act had been to save the life she now shared with the human and the child they had created together. His voice crackled one last time across the communication channel, weak and fading. He told his queen that he had been wrong, that he should have seen earlier what she had seen, that blood meant nothing compared to the bonds people chose to create. He told her to build something worthy of the sacrifice so many had made. He told her to show the universe what the future could look like. Then his signal died and the space where his ship had been was empty. Jack felt Seraphina's grief hardening into something sharper, something that would cut anyone who stood in its path. When she spoke to the fleet, her voice carried the weight of centuries and the fury of a queen wronged. She told Draven that he had made his choice. Now he would live with the consequences. The tide turned decisively when Tommy Reeves led his squadron on a suicide run against Draven's flagship. Jack had assigned Tommy to the mission with a heavy heart, knowing the risk involved, but also knowing that the young pilot was the best chance they had. Tommy had simply smiled and reminded Jack of the medallion he still wore, the one that had been lucky through so many deployments. The attack was magnificent and terrible. Human fighters weaving through defensive fire that should have vaporized them, exploiting gaps in Velthari, targeting systems that had never been designed to track vessels so small and agile. Tommy's squadron reached the flagship's shields and began hammering at the weakest points, their weapons insignificant individually, but devastating in concentrated application. Draven's ship shuddered under the assault, its defensive systems overwhelmed by an attack that violated every rule of engagement its designers had anticipated. The shields flickered and failed, leaving the flagship vulnerable for the crucial seconds that Seraphina's main batteries needed to find their mark. Tommy pulled his squadron back at the last possible moment, barely escaping the explosion that ripped through Draven's vessel. The High Commander's flagship did not die, but it was crippled, its power systems failing, its weapons offline, its crew scrambling to contain the damage. Jack saw his moment. He commandeered a shuttle and launched in pursuit, ignoring Seraphina's protests that thundered through their bond. Draven had transferred to an escape pod at the last moment, fleeing toward the nearest functional vessel. As long as the High Commander remained free, the war would continue. More lives would be lost in a conflict that had already claimed too many. The chase led through the debris field of the battle past the wreckage of ships that had carried thousands of souls into oblivion. Jack pushed the shuttle to its limits, closing the distance to Draven's escape pod with each passing second. Through his bond with Seraphina, he felt her fear for him mixing with her fury at his recklessness. He sent back reassurance that he knew she did not believe. Draven's pod docked with a damaged cruiser that still had functional engines. Jack followed, seconds later burning through the airlock with a plasma cutter and storming into the vessel with nothing but his sidearm and the desperate courage of a man with everything to lose. He found Draven on the bridge standing before a tactical display that showed the full extent of his failure. The Velthari commander towered over him, 8 feet of muscle and fury, his obsidian eyes burning with hatred that transcended reason. Blood seeped from a wound on his forehead, sustained during his escape, but he stood as straight and proud as if he were receiving honors at a victory parade. The confrontation that followed would become legend among both species, though the details would shift and blur through countless retellings. What mattered was the truth of it, the raw reality of two beings facing each other across a gulf of incomprehension. Draven spoke first, his voice carrying contempt that needed no translation. He wanted to know how Jack dared to challenge him. What gave a creature with a lifespan measured in decades the right to interfere in affairs that span centuries? What made him think that his primitive species could ever be anything more than a footnote in the grand history of the galaxy? Jack kept his weapon steady as he responded. He told Draven that love gave him the right. He told him that hope gave him the courage. He told him that the future belonged to those willing to build it, not those clinging to the ashes of the past. The High Commander laughed, a sound like breaking glass. He spoke of Seraphina, of the centuries he had watched her from afar, of the devotion he had buried beneath duty and honor and service. He had loved her longer than human civilization had existed. He had shaped himself into everything she needed, had sacrificed everything a man could sacrifice, had waited with patience that would have driven any human mad. And she had chosen a creature who would be dead before Draven's next century. She had bound her soul to an alien, had created an abomination that would tear the Empire apart, had thrown away 2 centuries of his devotion for a few years with a being whose life was barely a flicker compared to their own. Jack felt the pain beneath the fury, the broken heart that had twisted into something monstrous. He lowered his weapon slightly, a gesture that surprised them both. He told Draven that he understood. He told him that losing someone you loved to another was a special kind of agony, one that could destroy everything good in a person if they let it. He told him that he had watched Margaret slip away to cancer, had felt the rage that had nowhere to go when the enemy was something as impersonal as disease. He told him that grief could become poison if you held on to it too long. The words seemed to catch Draven off guard. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the rigid fury softening into something more complex. For a moment, they were just two beings who had loved and lost, standing in the wreckage of dreams that reality had refused to honor. Then Draven attacked. The High Commander moved with speed that human reflexes could barely track, closing the distance between them in the time it took Jack to raise his weapon. The impact drove him backwards, slamming him against a console hard enough to crack his armor. Draven's hands closed around his throat, lifting him from the ground as if he weighed nothing. Jack fought back with everything he had, but the physical mismatch was overwhelming. His combat training, his years of experience, his desperate will to survive all of it meant nothing against an opponent twice his size and 3 times his strength. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision as oxygen became a memory. Through their bond, he felt Seraphina screaming. The sensation gave him one final burst of strength, enough to reach the knife at his belt and drive it into the gap between Draven's armor plates. The High Commander grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Jack to break free. They faced each other across the blood-slicked deck, both wounded, both exhausted, both too determined to quit. Jack could have pressed the attack. Draven was hurt and off-balance, vulnerable in ways he had not been moments before. A quick strike, a ruthless decision, and the war would be over. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to become the killer that circumstance demanded. Instead, Jack dropped his weapon. Draven stared at him in disbelief, unable to process an action that violated everything he understood about combat. The human was surrendering, throwing away the advantage he had fought so hard to gain, offering his life to an enemy who had tried to kill him. Jack told him that this was not how their story ended. He told him that there had been enough death, enough destruction, enough pain to last both their species for generations. He told him that Seraphina did not want him dead, that despite everything, she still remembered the friend her husband had loved, the protector who had served faithfully before bitterness had poisoned everything. He told Draven that the future could still include him if he chose to be part of it rather than an obstacle to be overcome. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Draven's face cycled through emotions that Jack could not read, alien expressions that might have meant anything. Through his bond with Seraphina, he felt her holding her breath, felt her desperate hope that the madness might finally end without more blood. When Draven finally spoke, his voice had changed. The fury remained, but something else had joined it. Something that might have been exhaustion, or grief, or the first tentative acknowledgement that fighting was no longer the answer. He asked what would happen to him if he surrendered. What place there could possibly be for a traitor in the world Seraphina was building. What purpose his life could serve after everything he had done. Jack told him that those questions were above his pay grade. He told him that redemption was possible for anyone willing to seek it, that the measure of a being was not the mistakes they made, but how they responded when given the chance to make things right. He told him that the choice was Draven's to make, and only Draven's. The High Commander closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, the hatred had dimmed to something more like resignation. He sank to his knees on the bloody deck, his massive frame somehow diminished, and spoke words of surrender that echoed across the communication channels still linking both fleets. The war was over. Jack returned to the Imperial Dawn to find Seraphina in labor. The medical bay had been prepared for this moment, hybrid equipment combining Velthari technology with human medical knowledge that Diana Chen's ships had provided. Doctors from both species worked side by side, their differences forgotten, in the face of a birth that would change history. Jack pushed through them all to reach Seraphina's side, taking her hand as another contraction gripped her body. She looked at him with eyes that held fear and love in equal measure. Through their bond, he felt everything she was feeling, the pain and the hope and the overwhelming significance of what was about to happen. He told her that she was the strongest person he had ever known. He told her that their daughter would be magnificent. He told her that he loved her words that needed no translation. The birth itself defied everything the doctors thought they understood about reproduction. Energy pulsed through the medical bay as Seraphina's body completed a process that should have been impossible. Light emanated from her skin, growing brighter with each passing moment, until the entire ship seemed to vibrate with frequencies that resonated in the bones of everyone aboard. Then Nova was born and the universe changed forever. The child emerged into a world that was not ready for her, a hybrid of two species who had spent centuries regarding each other with suspicion at best and hostility at worst. She was smaller than a Velthari infant, would have been larger than a human newborn, her skin a softer shade of her mother's sunset coloring. When she opened her eyes, one was the gold of Seraphina's gaze, the other, the blue that Jack saw whenever he looked in a mirror. But it was what happened next that would be recorded in the histories of both peoples. Light exploded outward from Nova's tiny form, washing across the Imperial Dawn, and beyond, spreading through space at speeds that defied physics. Every ship in both fleets reported the same phenomenon, a wave of energy that passed through hulls and flesh and machinery without causing harm. And in its wake, something unprecedented occurred. Every being touched by the light experienced a moment of perfect connection. Velthari felt human emotions, understood human perspectives, glimpsed the universe through human eyes. Humans experienced the same in reverse, their consciousness briefly expanding to encompass the vast span of Velthari perception. For one eternal instant, the barriers between species dissolved entirely. Draven, in custody aboard a prison ship, wept as he finally understood the love that Jack and Seraphina shared. It was not the corruption he had imagined, not the weakness he had feared. It was something pure and powerful and utterly beyond his previous comprehension. In that moment of enforced empathy, the hatred that had driven him for so long simply evaporated, leaving behind only exhaustion and the first stirrings of genuine remorse. Across the fleet, weapon systems powered down as soldiers on both sides looked at their counterparts and saw not enemies but reflections of themselves. The peace that had been held together by exhaustion suddenly found a stronger foundation built on understanding that went deeper than words or treaties could ever achieve. Jack held his daughter and felt the connection she had created, the bridge she had built between two civilizations in the first moments of her existence. Through his bond with Seraphina, he sensed her wonder, her pride, her overwhelming love for the impossible child they had made together. Nova looked up at her father with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom despite their newborn freshness. Through the connection that linked all three of them, Jack heard something that might have been her first attempt at communication. A single concept expressed in feelings rather than words that would become the foundation of everything that followed. Family, not limited to blood or species. Family as choice. Family as the bonds people created when they decided that love was more important than fear. 6 months later, Jack stood in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace, watching delegates from 100 worlds debate the terms of an alliance that would reshape galactic civilization. The Houston Accords, they were calling it a framework for cooperation between humanity and the Velthari Empire that previous generations would have considered pure fantasy. Serafina sat on the throne that had been her burden for 2 centuries, but her posture held none of the isolation that had characterized her reign before Jack had crashed into her life. Nova rested in her arms, the hybrid child who had become a symbol of everything the Accords represented. Already she was growing faster than either species considered normal, her development tracking a curve that suggested she would be walking within weeks and talking within months. Tommy Reeves found Jack on the observation deck 3 days after the formal ceremonies concluded, the same kind of deck where their journey had truly begun. The young pilot had aged in ways that had nothing to do with time combat experience, etching lines around eyes that had once held nothing but optimism. Jack gestured for him to sit, and they watched the stars in companionable silence before Tommy asked the question that had clearly been burning in him. He wanted to know how Jack had done it, not the tactics or the strategy, but the harder thing. How had he kept going when everything suggested he should stop? How had he found the courage to love again after losing so much? Jack considered his answer carefully. He told Tommy that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else mattered more. He told him that the universe would take everything from you if you let it, but it could not take the choice of how you responded. He told him that wisdom was not knowing all the answers, but knowing which questions were worth asking. Tommy absorbed the words in silence. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and metallic. Not the medallion which Jack still wore around his neck, but a data chip. He pressed it into Jack's palm with an expression that carried weight beyond his years. For Nova, Tommy said. Recordings of their conversations, their tactical discussions, the moments when an old soldier had taught a young pilot how to think beyond the obvious, so she would know who her father really was and what he had believed in. Jack's throat tightened around words that refused to come. He simply nodded, and that was enough. Diana Chen rose to address the assembled delegates at the formal closing of the Accords, her posture carrying the weight of someone who had fought too many battles to be impressed by ceremony. She spoke of Jack Harrison, not the legend that was already forming around his name, but the man she had known for 40 years. The pilot who had refused an order and saved 200 lives. The officer who had been punished for his conscience and never complained. The soldier who had been discarded by a system that valued obedience over wisdom. She told them that humanity's greatest strength was not its technology or its numbers. It was the stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. She told them that the alliance they were forging had been built on the foundation of one man's determination to matter, to make a difference, to prove that experience and integrity still counted for something in a galaxy that often seemed to value neither. She told them that if they wanted to understand what this alliance could become, they needed only to look at the man holding his daughter in his arms. A man who had been told he was finished, who had been written off as obsolete, who had responded by changing the course of history. That, Diana concluded, was the human spirit, and now it was intertwined with the Velthari forever. Draven's fate had been decided the week before in a trial that had captivated both civilizations. The High Commander had pleaded guilty to charges of treason and attempted murder, accepting a responsibility for his actions in a statement that had surprised even those who thought they knew him. His sentence was not execution, as many had demanded, but service. He would spend the rest of his life protecting the child whose existence he had tried to prevent, guardian and prisoner, bound together by the same terrible irony. Jack had argued for that outcome, to the confusion of many who expected him to want vengeance. Killing Draven would have been easy. Letting him live, letting him work toward redemption was the harder choice. Jack had learned long ago that harder choices usually turned out to be the right ones. The night after the Accords were signed, Jack stood on the balcony of the Imperial Palace with Serafina beside him. The stars spread out before them, the same stars he had watched from the observation deck of the horizon a lifetime ago. Back then they had seemed cold and indifferent. Now they looked like possibility. Serafina asked if he had any regrets. About the crash, about the choices he had made, about the life he had left behind. Jack held Nova close and considered the question. He thought about Margaret, about Michael, about all the losses that had shaped him into the man who could make this moment possible. He thought about the mission that should have killed him, the Queen, who should have been his enemy, the child who should have been impossible. He told Serafina that he had spent 58 years learning how to lose. He told her that he was ready to spend whatever years remained learning how to win instead. He told her that life rarely offered second chances, and he had no intention of wasting the one the universe had thrown at him. Nova made a sound that might have been laughter, and every light in the palace flickered in response. The delegates paused in their conversations, reminded once again that the future they were building had a mind of its own. Jack smiled and held his family close, a broken old soldier who had found his purpose at last. There would be more challenges ahead, more enemies to face, more impossible odds to overcome. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jack Harrison was looking forward to finding out what came next. The story of how a retired pilot had changed the fate of two civilizations would be told for generations, embellished and simplified and transformed into legend. But the truth was simpler than any legend could capture. He had crashed on the wrong planet, met the right woman, and refused to give up when giving up would have been easier. He had learned that courage meant choosing to love again, even when love had broken him before. He had discovered that the measure of a life was not its length, but its depth, not its comfort, but its meaning. And in the end, that was all it took to change everything. The universe would keep testing them. Jack knew that with the certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime being tested. But as he stood there with his alien queen and their impossible daughter, watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, he felt ready for whatever came next. Some stories ended with happiness. Others ended with triumph. The best ones, Jack thought, ended with the understanding that endings were really just beginnings in disguise. This was not the end of his story. It was the first chapter of something new. And for a man who had spent so long waiting to die, the chance to start living again was the greatest gift the universe could have given him.